The Hall of Resonance was a cathedral of silence, constructed entirely from singing crystals that grew naturally from the planet's crust. It was designed to amplify the slightest psionic tremor, turning thought into light and emotion into sound. For 1,000 years, the daughters of the Zivara royal line had stood upon the central dais to prove their worthiness. Today, the galaxy watched Princess Virelli. She stood before the massive, towering arch of the ancestral prism, her heart rate forcibly slowed by years of mental conditioning, her skin, pale and luminescent like moonlight trapped in porcelain, shimmered under the ceremonial robes of woven starlight. She was the golden child of Zivara, the one the populace adored. They called her the Star Walker, the one who would modernize their rigid ancient empire. But titles meant nothing inside the hall. Here, only biology and spirit mattered. The high priest, a withered figure floating a few inches off the ground using telekinetic drifts, raised a four-fingered hand. The crowd, thousands of high-caste nobles and clan leaders, held their breath. The air was thick with telepathic anticipation, a heavy static that pressed against Virelli's skull. "Begin the rite of continuity," the priest's voice echoed, not in the air, but directly inside the minds of everyone present. "Prove the viability of your essence. Illuminate the future." Virelli closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the neural-linked crown resting on her brow, a delicate lattice of silver and psionic reactive gems. It connected her to the planetary grid, to the history of her people. And today, it was supposed to connect her to the future. She reached deep into her core, searching for the spark, the specific radiant biopsionic pulse that indicated a royal female was capable of carrying a telepathic air. It was a sensation she had practiced simulating in training, a warmth in the lower abdomen that spiraled up into the mind. She pushed, she focused, she willed the energy to flow. Usually the prism would erupt in a symphony of violet and gold light, singing a harmonious chord that signaled fertility and power. Instead, there was nothing. Virelli pushed harder, panic fluttering behind her mental shields like a trapped bird. She strained until her temples throbbed, pouring every ounce of her legendary psionic strength into the connection. But the channel remained dead. The feedback loop was cold, hollow, and terrifyingly empty. The silence in the hall stretched, transforming from reverent to horrified. 1 minute passed, then 2. The prism remained a dull, lifeless gray. A murmur rippled through the mental network, a collective gasp of shock that hit Virelli like a physical blow. She opened her eyes, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. The gathered nobles were staring at her, their faces masks of pity and revulsion. To be infertile on Zivara was not merely a medical condition, it was a spiritual failure. It meant the ancestors had rejected her. It meant her genetic line was a dead end. The high priest lowered his hand. The movement was final. "The vessel is empty," he projected, his mental voice cold and devoid of sympathy. "The light does not take root. There is no continuity here." Virelli stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. This was impossible. She was the strongest telepath in 3 generations. She was healthy. She was young. Mother, she projected, turning desperately toward the high throne where Queen Izala sat. The queen did not stand. She did not offer a hand of comfort. Her face, usually a mask of regal indifference, hardened into something brittle and cruel. The queen rose slowly, her robes flowing like liquid mercury. She looked down at her daughter, not with love, but with the calculating assessment of a broker discarding a worthless asset. "You have shamed the bloodline," Queen Izala said aloud, breaking the tradition of silent communication. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the humid air of the chamber. A barren branch must be pruned so the tree may survive. Virelli took a step forward, her hands shaking. This is a mistake. The prism is malfunctioning. Let me try again. Guards, the queen commanded. Remove the defect. Prepare the vessel for immediate departure. The word defect struck Virelli harder than any weapon. It was a slur used for the lower castes, for the genetic dead ends working the fusion mines. To hear it from her mother was a death sentence. Virelli sensed a flicker of something else beneath the queen's icy surface, a jagged spike of satisfaction, or perhaps relief. It was there and gone in a microsecond, hidden behind walls of mental iron. But Virelli had felt it. This was not just about tradition, this was political. She had advocated for opening trade with the lower systems, for softening the caste laws. She was dangerous to the old ways, and now she is gone. 2 members of the royal guard, warriors she had known since childhood, stepped onto the dais. They did not look her in the eye as they grabbed her arms. "No!" Virelli screamed, her psionic power flaring out in a shockwave that shattered the nearest decorative vases. The guards grunted but held firm, their armor dampening her mental blast. One of them reached up and tore the neural crown from her head. The disconnection was brutal, a sudden blinding white pain that severed her link to the planetary grid. Virelli collapsed, blind and deaf to the collective mind for the first time in her life. Dragged away into the shadows of the hall while the crowd watched in silent judgment. The exile was conducted with ruthless efficiency. There were no farewells, no packing of personal belongings. Virelli was stripped of her shimmering robes and dressed in a gray, synthetic jumpsuit, the uniform of the Banished. She was marched into a sterile, white hangar bay where a small, unmanned transport pod waited. It was an archaic design, lacking a hyperdrive, capable only of short-range jumps to the fringe sectors. Queen Izala stood on the observation deck above, separated by a wall of reinforced glass. Virelli looked up, her violet eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. "Why?" she mouthed. The queen turned her back and walked away. Virelli was shoved into the pod. The airlock hissed shut, sealing her in a coffin of metal and plastic. The automated systems engaged, a monotone voice reciting safety protocols that sounded like a funeral dirge. Destination set, Sector 9, Bastion system. The computer announced, Bastion 3, the fringe. It was a dumping ground for nuclear waste and unwanted biological experiments. A moon inhabited by humans, the reckless scavengers of the galaxy. It was a fate worse than execution. The launch was violent. The pod was blasted out of the orbital dock, tumbling into the void, as Zivara shrank into a sparkling jewel behind her. Virelli curled into a ball in the acceleration chair. She was alone. The silence in her head, usually filled with the comforting hum of the collective, was now a gaping wound. She drifted for 3 standard days in cryo-sleep, a dreamless void. She woke to the screaming of alarms. Red light pulsed through the small cabin. The ship was shaking violently, metal groaning under immense stress. Warning, guidance system failure. The computer blared. Atmospheric entry trajectory unstable. Hull integrity at 40%. Virelli clawed at the restraints, her heart hammering against her ribs, and this was not an accident. Royal transport pods were built to withstand asteroid impacts. Someone had tampered with the navigation relays. They did not just want her exiled, they wanted her erased. The pod hit the atmosphere of Bastion 3 like a meteorite. Gravity slammed Virelli back into her seat, the G-force crushing the air from her lungs. Through the small viewport, she saw flames licking the heat shield. Below, A gray, swirling cloud layer rushed up to meet her. She closed her eyes and tried to reach out with her mind, to push against the ground, to use telekinesis to slow the descent. But without the neural crown to amplify her focus, her power was a whisper against a hurricane. The impact was a thunderclap of tearing metal and shattering composite. The world spun, flipped, and then stopped with a bone-jarring crunch. Silence returned, but it was not the holy silence of the crystal hall. It was the silence of ringing ears and settling dust. Virelli gasped, tasting copper and smoke. She fumbled for the release latch, her fingers numb. The hatch blew open with a hiss of hydraulic failure. She pulled herself out, tumbling onto wet, muddy ground. Rain, heavy and smelling of sulfur and oil, pelted her face. She coughed, her lungs burning with the thick, unfiltered air. She was alive, but her left leg screamed in agony, twisted at a sickening angle. She looked up. The sky was a bruised purple, choked with smog. Around her lay a graveyard of rusted machinery, husks of old starships, piles of scrap metal, and the skeletal remains of mining towers. This was the garbage moon. Movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the gloom, silhouette against the flickering lights of a distant settlement. It was big, broad-shouldered and heavy. A human. Virelli tried to summon a psionic blast to defend herself, but her energy was depleted, her mind fractured by the crash. She slumped back against the wreckage of her pod, shivering uncontrollably. The figure approached, boots squelching in the mud. A beam of light cut through the rain, blinding her. "Well, ain't that a spectacularly bad parking job?" a rough, gravelly voice said. The language was universal standard, but the accent was thick, lazy, and decidedly unrefined. The light moved away from her face, revealing a man. He was tall, wearing a grease-stained leather jacket and heavy cargo pants covered in pockets. His face was a map of stubble and grime, marked by a jagged scar running from his jaw to his ear. He held a heavy wrench in one hand as if it were an extension of his arm. Virelli drew herself up, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. "I require assistance," she said, her voice trembling but imperious. "I am a diplomat. My vessel suffered a malfunction." The man, Elias Thorne, looked at the smoking crater, then back at the woman in the gray jumpsuit. He saw the violet eyes, too bright, too deep to be human. He saw the delicate bone structure, the way she held herself even while lying in the mud. "A diplomat," Elias repeated, his tone dry, "in a one-way escape pod rigged to blow. You're a terrible liar, sweetheart. I command you to help me," Virelli snapped, panicking, making her arrogant. Elias laughed, a short, barking sound. "You command me? Lady, you're on Bastion 3. The only thing that commands anyone here is credits and caliber." He stepped closer, kneeling beside her. He looked at her leg and winced. "That looks nasty." "Do not touch me," she hissed, flinching away. "Fine," Elias said, standing up and turning around. "Enjoy the acid rain. It usually eats through synthetic fabric in about 20 minutes. Virelli looked at the sky. Her skin was already itching. The cold was seeping into her bones, a sensation she had never truly experienced in the climate-controlled perfection of the palace. Fear, raw and primal, finally broke through her training. "Wait," she whispered. Elias stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "Please," she added, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at the wreckage, then at her. He hated complications. He hated imperial types. But he couldn't leave a stray dog out in this storm, let alone a person. He walked back, holstered the wrench on his belt, and scooped her up in his arms. She was shockingly light, like holding a bird made of glass. "Don't vomit on the jacket," Elias grunted. "It's vintage leather." Virelli squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea and pain as he carried her through the rain toward a flickering neon sign that read, "Thorn's Salvage Repair." The days that followed were a blur of sensory overload. Elias lived in a converted hangar bay attached to his workshop. It was a chaotic cavern of metal parts, hanging wires, and half-assembled engines. It smelled of oil, ozone, stale coffee, and something muskier, human sweat. To Virelli, who came from a world of antiseptic cleanliness and scentless air, it was overwhelming. She lay on a cot in the corner of the workshop, her leg bound in a splint Elias had fashioned from a polymer strut. He had set the bone himself, giving her a shot of cheap whiskey for the pain because he lacked medical nanobots. She had screamed, a sound that had made him pale, but he had done it with surprisingly gentle hands. Virelli lay there, watching him work. He was a creature of constant motion. He welded, he hammered, he cursed at rusted bolts. He listened to loud, jarring music with rhythmic beating drums that made her teeth ache. She experienced sensations she had no names for. Hunger was the first shock. On Zivara, nutrients were injected via painless hyposprays. Here, her stomach growled, a feral animal living inside her. Elias fed her heated protein paste and stale bread. The texture was revolting, requiring her to chew, to swallow, to feel the food slide down her throat. But after the first day, she found herself craving the salty, savory taste. Cold was the second. The hangar was drafty. She learned to wrap herself in the rough wool blankets he provided, discovering the simple, profound pleasure of friction and warmth. Pain was the constant. Her leg throbbed. Her head ached from the severed neural link. But beneath the pain, she felt present. On Zivara, discomfort was chemically suppressed immediately. Here, she had to live inside her body. She felt the blood pumping in her veins. She felt the air entering her lungs. Elias was a puzzle. He was rude. He ignored her for hours. He mocked her formal speech patterns. "Could you perhaps attempt to be less abrasive?" she asked one evening, watching him wipe grease from his hands with a rag. "Could you perhaps attempt to be less of a princess?" he shot back, not looking up. "I am not a princess," she lied, though she knew he didn't believe her. "I am a diplomat named Vara." "Right, Vara. And I'm the Emperor of the Moon," Elias said, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "You float when you think nobody is looking. You glow when you get agitated. You're Zivaran royalty, or high caste at least, which means you're in trouble." "Why do you keep me here then?" she asked. "Why not turn me in for a bounty?" Elias stopped. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Maybe I just like the company. Or maybe I know what it's like to be thrown away." He walked over and handed her a mug of hot, dark liquid, coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, callous, and impossibly warm. A shock went through her, not psionic, but bioelectric. "Drink up, Your Highness. Storm's coming in tonight. It's going to get loud." The storm that night was an atmospheric violent event. Bastion 3 was prone to electrical tempests, and this one shook the hangar to its foundations. Thunder boomed like orbital bombardment. Virelli sat on her cot, knees pulled to her chest. Every clap of thunder made her flinch. In her world, the weather was controlled, scheduled, and mild. This untamed fury terrified her. Elias was working late, welding a seal on a smuggler's thruster. He saw her jumping at the noise. He turned off his torch, flipped his welding mask up, and walked over. "Scared?" he asked. I do not experience fear, she said, her voice trembling. I am merely overstimulated. You're shaking, Elias observed. He sat down on a crate near her cot. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof, a deafening roar. Why do you live like this? Virelli asked suddenly, her voice rising to be heard over the storm. In this filth, in this chaos? Humans, you are so inefficient. You are ruled by biological impulses. You eat solid matter. You sleep in piles of fabric. You let the weather dictate your safety. It's called living. Vara, Elias said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It's messy. It hurts. But it's real. Your reality is painful, she countered. On Zivara, we have transcended these basic needs. We live in logic. We live in the light. And yet, here you are, Elias said softly, in the mud, with me. Virelli fell silent. He was right. Her logic had exiled her. Her light had failed her. You humans, she whispered, looking at him. You embrace desire. You embrace anger. You embrace things that cloud judgment. Why? Elias looked at her. The lightning flashed outside, illuminating his scarred face, the intensity in his eyes. Because without them, you're just a machine made of meat, he said. Logic keeps you safe. Desire makes you feel alive. It reminds you that you exist. He reached out, almost hesitantly, and brushed a strand of silver hair away from her face. His hand lingered on her cheek. Virelli froze. By Zevaran law, no male could touch a royal female without a courtship contract. It was taboo. It was forbidden. But his thumb brushed her cheekbone, rough and gentle at the same time. The sensation was electric. It bypassed her brain and went straight to the strange, hollow ache in her chest. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. What is this? She breathed. Adrenaline, Elias murmured. Or maybe just chemistry. He leaned in. Virelli smelled the oil, the rain, and the man. It was a scent of survival. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't like the polite, telepathic mergers of her people. It was a collision. It was hot, wet, and shocking. Virelli gasped against his mouth, and Elias took that as an invitation. He deepened the kiss, one hand moving to the back of her neck to steady her. Logic shattered. The mental barriers she had spent 20 years perfecting crumbled under the assault of pure physical sensation. She didn't just feel his lips, she felt his loneliness, his hidden kindness, his jagged edges. And he must have felt her too, her desperation, her fear, and the sudden, overwhelming need to be held. She moaned into his mouth, a sound of surrender. Her hands, usually so poised, grabbed the lapels of his leather jacket, pulling him closer. She wanted to be closer than physics allowed. She wanted to burn in this chaos. She was breaking 1,000 laws. She was defiling her caste. She was proving herself impure. And for the first time since the Hall of Resonance, the cold void inside her vanished, replaced by a roaring fire. Elias pulled back for a second, breathless, his forehead resting against hers. You sure about this, princess? Virelli looked at him, her pupils dilated, her skin flushing a deep, bioluminescent violet. I am not a princess, she whispered fiercely, pulling him back down. Not tonight. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the dark, greasy workshop, a new universe was being born, one forged not in silence and light, but in breath, skin, and the messy, beautiful heat of being alive. The morning light on Bastion 3 did not break. It seeped. It was a bruise-colored illumination that filtered through the smog layer, turning the puddles of oil and rainwater outside the hangar into iridescent slicks. Inside the workshop, The air was heavy with the metallic tang of cold machinery and the lingering musk-heavy scent of the night before. Elias Thorne was already awake. He stood by the primary workbench, his back to the cot where Virelli lay. He was aggressively dismantling a combustion intake valve, his movements jerky and precise. He was attacking the metal with a wrench, forcing his mind to focus on torque ratios and thread alignments. Anything to drown out the memory of her skin against his, the sound of her voice breaking in the dark. He felt hollowed out. He was a man who lived by simple rules: survive, get paid, don't get attached. Last night, he had taken a blowtorch to all three. He had slept with a refugee, a woman who spoke like a queen and looked like a galaxy, and now the daylight brought the crushing weight of reality. She was a complication he could not afford. Virelli stirred. She sat up, the rough wool blanket pooling around her waist. She felt different. On Zivara, waking was a calibrated process. The neural crown would gently stimulate the waking center of the brain, and a nutrient slurry would be administered intravenously before one even opened their eyes. Here. She woke with a dry throat and a strange humming vibration deep in her marrow. She looked at her hands. In the dim light, her skin seemed to possess a pearlescent quality, a faint rhythmic shimmer that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She felt heavy, yet anchored. The hollowness that had defined her since the failure at the ceremony of continuity was gone, replaced by a sensation of fullness, of biological circuitry closing a loop she had not known was open. "Elias," she said softly. The mechanic stiffened but did not turn around. "There is coffee in the pot. It is stale." Virelli swung her legs off the cot. The pain in her injured leg had dulled to a distant throb, overshadowed by the new energy coursing through her. She pulled the oversized mechanic's shirt she had borrowed tighter around her frame. "About last night," Elias said, his voice grating like rocks in a grinder. "We need to be clear. That was a stress reaction, adrenaline, proximity. It happens." Virelli paused, her hand halfway to the coffee mug. The dismissal stung, sharp and immediate. But beneath the hurt, she sensed his fear. Without her telepathy, she had to read him the human way, the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckle grip on the wrench. "Is that all it was?" she asked, her voice cool, regaining some of her imperial cadence. "A biological discharge?" Elias turned then, his face a mask of cynical exhaustion. "Look at where we are. Vara, I fix trash for a living. You are, whatever you are, a runaway diplomat. We are not a love story. We are two people stuck in a salvage yard waiting for the heat to die down. Don't make it into something it isn't." Virelli looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the panic behind his eyes. He was terrified of the vulnerability they had shared. She wanted to argue, to tell him that for her, it had been a revelation. But her pride, the last remnant of her royal training, clamped her mouth shut. "Understood," she said, lifting her chin. "It will not happen again." "Good," Elias said, turning back to the valve. But as she turned away, the glow beneath her skin flared brighter, a soft violet luminescence that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Elias missed it, but Virelli felt it, a surge of heat in her abdomen, a knitting together of cells that felt like the igniting of a star. Parsecs away, in the gleaming spire of ascendancy on Zivara, the atmosphere was one of sterile celebration. Prince Kale stood before a wall of liquid information, watching the succession metrics realign in real time. He was a strikingly beautiful man, his features sharp and symmetrical, his eyes the color of polished jade. He held a goblet of nectar, the condensation cool against his fingertips. The data streams were turning green, With Virelli exiled and declared genetically defunct, the lines of inheritance had shifted. The ancient algorithms of the High Council had no choice but to designate the next closest blood relative as the primary heir to the continuity. Cale toasted the empty room, taking a sip. The door to his sanctum hissed open. His personal adjutant, a female of the scholar caste with cybernetic ocular implants, stepped in and bowed low. "My prince," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The perimeter drones in the Bastion sector have ceased transmission." Cale turned slowly. "Ceased? We suspect atmospheric interference," she said. But before the signal died, the deep-range quantum scanners picked up an anomaly. A resonance signature. Very faint. Cale's eyes narrowed. A resonance signature? Like a ship drive? Like a biological event, the adjutant corrected. It matched the frequency of the royal house, specifically, the frequency of the exile. Cale set the goblet down with a sharp click. Virelli was supposed to be dead, or at least lost in the chaotic squalor of the fringe. Slowly dying of radiation poisoning or local diseases. If she was generating a resonance signature strong enough to be detected across sectors. She was not only alive, she was active. "She is persistent," Cale murmured, a cold smile touching his lips. "It seems the sabotage on her pod was insufficient." "Shall I dispatch a retrieval team?" the adjutant asked. "No," Cale said. "Retrieval implies value. Send the erasure unit, and tell them to be thorough. If she is resonating, she is a threat to the stability of the realm. The narrative is that she is barren and broken. We cannot have her proving otherwise." Back on Bastion 3, the afternoon had turned sweltering. The humidity rose until the air felt like warm soup. Elias was under the chassis of a hover skiff, welding a patch onto the intake manifold. Virelli sat on a crate near the open hangar doors, watching the acid rain begin to drizzle again. She felt nauseous, a sudden violent wave of sickness that passed as quickly as it came, leaving her lightheaded. She placed a hand on her stomach. The skin there felt hot, feverishly so. Inside the workshop, a shrill chirp cut through the noise of the rain. It was Elias's long-range communication console, a piece of illegal hardware he used to track smuggling routes. Elias slid out from under the skiff, flipping his welding mask up. He wiped grease across his forehead and walked to the console. He tapped the receiver. "Thorn." He grunted. The voice that answered was heavily distorted, scrambled through layers of encryption. It sounded synthetic, genderless. Elias Thorn. Former designation, Engineer Second Class, Terran Hegemony. Current status, Independent Contractor. Elias stiffened. "Who is this?" "A friend of the truth," the voice rasped. "You are harboring a fugitive." Elias's eyes flicked to Virelli, who was staring out at the rain. Oblivious. "I don't know what you're talking about. Do not lie to the network. Thorn, we tracked the quantum decay trail of a Zeveran escape pod to your grid coordinates. The occupant is a Class Alpha political exile." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had known she was highborn. He hadn't realized she was radioactive. "What do you want?" Elias asked, his voice low. "To warn you," the voice said. "A Zeveran hunter-killer team has just authorized a jump vector for the Bastion system. They are not coming to arrest her. They are coming to sanitize the site. Sanitize. Burn it to the ground. You have less than 12 hours before they enter orbit. If you value your life, Thorn, you will give her up, or you will run." The connection severed with a static hiss. Elias stood frozen for a moment, the silence of the hangar rushing back in. Rage, hot and white, flooded his chest. He had been playing. She had lied to him. She wasn't just a diplomat. She was a target that was going to bring an orbital bombardment down on his head. He turned and marched toward her. "Virelli!" he roared. She jumped, turning to face him. Her eyes widened at the fury on his face. "Elias? You lied to me," he shouted, closing the distance. He grabbed her arm, too hard, and spun her around. "Diplomat, a failed vessel. You are a walking death sentence." Virelli pulled back, wincing. "Elias, please, you are hurting me. Who are you?" he demanded, shaking her. "Who are you really?" "I just got a call from deep space telling me a kill team is on its way. They are coming to wipe this place off the map because of you." Virelli's face went pale. "Kale," she whispered. "He knows." "Who is Kale?" Elias yelled. "And who are you?" "I am Princess Virelli of the House of Zivara," she screamed back, the truth tearing out of her. The confession hung in the air between them. Elias let go of her arm as if he had been burned. He took a step back, staring at her. "A princess," he spat, the word dripping with disgust. "A royal. You people treat the galaxy like your personal playground. You start wars, you tax colonies into starvation, and then you come here, to my home, and drag me into your family drama?" "I had no choice," Virelli pleaded, tears gathering in her eyes. "They exiled me. They tried to kill me. I had nowhere else to go." "You used me," Elias said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet. "You played the damsel. You slept with me to keep me compliant." "No!" Virelli cried, stepping toward him. "That is not true. Last night was real." "Was it?" Elias laughed bitterly. "Or was it just another manipulation? A way to secure a bodyguard?" Virelli opened her mouth to defend herself, but the words died in her throat. A sudden, blinding pain lanced through her abdomen. It was not the pain of injury, it was a searing, expanding pressure, as if her very DNA was being rewritten in real time. She gasped, clutching her stomach. The violet glow beneath her skin flared violently, turning from a soft shimmer to a blinding beacon. The light poured through the fabric of her jumpsuit. "Virelli?" Elias said, his anger faltering as he saw her face twist in agony. "Something is wrong." She gasped. She collapsed. Elias caught her before she hit the concrete floor. Her body was burning up, radiating heat like a furnace. Her skin was translucent, veins pulsing with liquid light. "Virelli!" Elias shouted, tapping her cheek. "Stay with me." "It burns," she moaned, her eyes rolling back. "The light. It is too much." Elias scooped her up, panic overriding his fury. He ran toward the back of the workshop, kicking open the door to the loading dock. He threw her into the passenger seat of his rover, a battered all-terrain vehicle. "Hold on," he grit out, jumping into the driver's seat. "I know a guy, a butcher, but he has a scanner." Doc Scrapper's clinic was located in the sub-basement of an abandoned refinery. It was a place where questions were never asked, and payment was accepted in credits. Scrap metal, or favors. The doc was a trembling old man with cybernetic hands that twitched until he held a scalpel, at which point they became rock steady. He stood over the diagnostic table where Virelli lay unconscious, the violet light from her body illuminating the grime on the ceiling. Elias paced the small room, his hands covered in grease and Virelli's glowing sweat. "What is it? Is it radiation? A virus?" "Shut up, kid," Scrapper grumbled, adjusting the focus on his bioscanner. The machine was ancient, a relic from the pre-war era, but it hummed with reliability. The holographic display above the table flickered to life. It showed Virelli's anatomy, her skeletal structure, lighter and denser than a human's, her nervous system, a complex web of psionic nodes, and her organs. Scrapper squinted at the display. He tapped the screen, zooming in on the abdominal cavity. He frowned. Then he widened his eyes. He looked at Elias, then back at the screen. "Well," Scrapper said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand, "that explains the energy surge." "What?" Elias snapped. "Is she dying?" "No," Scrapper said, a dry chuckle escaping his throat. "Quite the opposite. She's creating life." Elias froze. "Excuse me. She's pregnant." "Elias?" The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Elias stared at the doctor, then at the glowing woman on the table. "That's impossible. It was one night. One night, less than 24 hours ago. Alien biology." Scrapper shrugged. "Look at the metabolic rate. It's off the charts. Her cells are dividing at a hyper-accelerated pace to accommodate the fetus. Whatever species she is, they don't waste time. The conception triggered a systemic physiological overhaul. That's why she's glowing. It's a psionic shielding mechanism for the womb." Elias walked to the table, his legs feeling like lead. He looked down at her. Pregnant. The word bounced around his skull, refusing to settle. Virelli's eyes fluttered open. The intense burning had faded to a dull, warm hum. She saw Elias looming over her, his face a mixture of shock and terror. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're at the clinic," Elias said, his voice hollow. She tried to sit up, but Scrapper pushed her gently back down. "Easy, girl. Your body is working overtime. You need to rest." "What is happening to me?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "The heat inside me." "You're pregnant," Scrapper said bluntly. Virelli stared at him. The silence that followed was absolute. She looked at Elias, waiting for the punchline, the cruelty, but Elias just stared back. Stunned. "No," Virelli whispered. "That is a mistake. I am infertile. I failed the ceremony. The prism. It showed nothing. The machine doesn't lie, sweetheart," Scrapper said, tapping the holographic display. "See that pulse? That's a second heartbeat. Or something like a heartbeat. It's strong. And it's drawing a hell of a lot of power from you." Virelli slowly moved her hand to her stomach. She closed her eyes and reached inward, not with the desperate, forced push she had used in the Hall of Resonance, but with a soft, questioning touch. And there it was. It wasn't a void. It wasn't silence. It was a song, a tiny, fierce, golden hum of existence nestled deep within her. It felt nothing like the cold, sterile simulations of the academy. It felt chaotic. It felt warm. It felt human. She gasped, tears spilling over her lashes. They were wrong. She choked out. She looked at Elias, a smile breaking through her tears, radiant and terrified. They were wrong. "I am not broken." Elias couldn't smile. He felt like the walls were closing in. A baby, a royal alien baby with a kill team on the way. Virelli sat up, swinging her legs off the table, ignoring Scrapper's protests. The truth hit her with the force of a revelation. "The ceremony," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It tests for genetic purity. It tests for compatibility with the existing bloodlines. But my body, Gornon, it rejected the stagnation. It didn't want a Zivaran mate. It was wanted." She looked at Elias. It wanted authentic connection. It wanted love. "Don't call it that," Elias snapped, the panic finally finding a voice. "Don't romanticize this. You are pregnant in a dirty clinic on a garbage moon. And there are assassins coming to kill us. This isn't a miracle. Virelli, it's a catastrophe." Virelli slid off the table, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. She stood taller than she had before, the shame that had bowed her spine completely gone. "No," she said firmly. "It is a weapon." Elias blinked. "What?" "The law of continuity," Virelli explained, her mind racing, connecting the dots of legal code she had memorized as a child. A royal exile is absolute unless the exile carries a viable heir. If an heir exists, the exile is null and void. The bloodline must be protected. It is the supreme directive. So, Elias threw his hands up. You think the assassins care about your laws? Kale sent them to kill you before anyone finds out. Exactly, Varelli said, which means we cannot hide. If we hide, they hunt us down and erase us. But if I return, if I stand before the council and show them this child, Kale cannot touch me. The law would bind him. Elias stared at her as if she had lost her mind. You want to go back? To the place that threw you out the airlock? You want to take, he gestured vaguely at her stomach, my kid, into a nest of vipers? It is our only chance. Elias, no, Elias said, shaking his head. No way. We run. We take my ship. We go to the outer rim. I know places where nobody looks. We disappear. I will not disappear, Varelli cried, her eyes flashing violet. I have spent my whole life being what they wanted me to be. Perfect. Silent. And when I failed, they threw me away. I will not raise this child in the shadows. I will not let him be a fugitive because of their lies. Him? Elias asked, his voice catching. Varelli paused. She hadn't known she knew, but she did. Yes. A son. She stepped closer to Elias, invading his personal space. She took his rough, grease-stained hands in hers. He tried to pull away, but she held fast. Elias, look at me. He looked. He saw the fire in her eyes, a strength that terrified and mesmerized him. I cannot do this without you, she said. You are the father. You are part of this story now, whether you want to be or not. I'm just a mechanic, Elias whispered, his voice cracking. I'm nobody. You are the man who saved me, she said fiercely. You are the man who woke me up. She placed his hand on her stomach. The warmth was intense, radiating through his palm. For a second, Elias thought he felt a vibration, a tiny answering thrum against his skin. The reality of it anchored him. This wasn't politics. This wasn't a galactic war. This was life. His life. He closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. We're going to die, he muttered. Varelli smiled, and it was the most beautiful, dangerous thing he had ever seen. Then we will die fighting. They returned to the hangar under the cover of darkness. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick and still. They didn't speak as they packed. Elias threw tools, rations, and weapons into crates. Varelli gathered the few charts and data pads she could salvage. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer the jagged friction of strangers, but the tight, synchronized focus of a team. When the work was done, the silence returned. The ship, a modified light freighter Elias called the Rusty Nail, sat waiting in the bay. It was ugly, scary, and fast. Elias sat on the edge of the cargo ramp, staring at the floor. Varelli walked over and sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. You're really going to do this? Elias asked quietly. Challenge an empire. I have to, she said. Elias turned to look at her. The glow under her skin had settled into a soft, golden aura. She looked ethereal, yet terrifyingly solid. I never asked for this, Elias said. I know, she answered. He looked at her mouth. He looked at the curve of her neck. The anger he had felt earlier had burned itself out, leaving behind something raw, something that scared him more than the assassins. He reached out and touched her face. This time, he didn't pull back. Varelli turned into his touch, her eyes closing. You are sure, he asked, about us, about everything? Varelli opened her eyes. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. "I was empty," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "I was a vessel waiting to be filled. But nothing fit. The light didn't fit. The crown didn't fit." She kissed the corner of his mouth, soft and slow. "You gave me chaos, Elias. You gave me pain, and you gave me life. When I thought I was nothing, you made me unreal." Elias made a low sound in his throat and pulled her into him. This time, it wasn't a frantic collision of desperation. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was an acknowledgement of the bond that had tethered them together against all odds. They moved together in the shadow of the ship that would carry them to war. Elias kissed her with a reverence he hadn't known he possessed, worshipping the skin that glowed under his touch. Virelli held him with a strength that belied her delicate frame, anchoring him to the earth as he anchored her to the present. There was no need for telepathy. The language of their bodies was ancient and universal. In the quiet dark of the hangar, with the threat of death racing toward them through the void, they affirmed the life they had created. They made love not to forget, but to remember why they were fighting. As Elias held her, his hand resting protectively over the golden warmth of her womb, he knew his life as a cynical loner was over. He was a father, he was a partner, and he was about to go to war with the galaxy for the woman sleeping in his arms. The rusty nail was not a vessel designed for beauty. It was a brick with thrusters, a patchwork of welded hull plates and salvaged heat shields that looked like it had been chewed up and spat out by a black hole. But beneath the ugly, scarred exterior, Elias Thorne had buried the heart of a racing interceptor. He had spent the last 48 hours awake, fueled by stimcaf and sheer terror-induced adrenaline, ripping out the standard indent transponders and replacing them with illegal ghost emitters. He stripped the cargo hold to reduce mass, rerouted the life support power to the rear deflectors, and calibrated the slipstream drive to run hot. Dangerously hot. "We are heavy on the starboard thruster," Elias muttered, his fingers flying across the holographic interface of the cockpit. Virelli sat in the co-pilot's seat. Pilots. She wore a flight suit that was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her violet eyes were fixed on the rear sensor array. "They are gaining," she said, her voice calm but tight. 3 signatures, Hunter-class interceptors. Zeveran configuration. Elias swore softly. The assassination team. Kale hadn't wasted time. The moment the rumor of Virelli's survival had hit the subspace relays, a whisper carried on the encrypted winds of the smuggling guilds. The hunt had begun. They weren't just bounty hunters, they were the erasure unit, the Emperor's personal cleaners. "Hold on." Elias gritted out. He slammed the throttle forward. The rusty nail shuddered, the structural integrity fields groaning under the sudden G-force. The ship didn't just accelerate, it screamed, tearing a hole through the upper atmosphere of Bastion 3. On the sensor screen, the 3 pursuing red dots flared. They fired, plasma torpedoes that streaked through the void like angry hornets. Elias yanked the yoke hard to the left. The ship rolled, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. A torpedo grazed their shields, sending a shockwave through the hull that rattled Virelli's teeth. Sparks rained down from the overhead console. "They are locking on again," Virelli warned. "Do you trust me?" Elias asked, sweat stinging his eyes. "Do I have a choice?" Not really. Elias killed the engines. The ship dropped like a stone, momentum carrying it into a breathless drift. The sudden loss of thermal output confused the torpedo's guidance systems. The missiles overshot, streaking past them into the dark. In that split second of silence, Elias punched the hyperdrive initialization sequence. The driver whined, a high-pitched keen that vibrated in their chests. "Punch it," Elias whispered. Space outside the viewport elongated, stars stretching into lines of infinite white, with a thunderclap that no one could hear. The rusty nail vanished into the slipstream, leaving the hunters biting at empty vacuum. 3 days in hyperspace felt like 3 years. The ship was a metal coffin, smelling of recycled air and ozone. The tension was a physical weight, pressing them together in the cramped corridors. Virelli spent most of her time in the small med bay Elias had jury-rigged. She sat cross-legged on the bunk, eyes closed, hands resting on her stomach. The glow beneath her skin had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse, a bioluminescent heartbeat that illuminated the dim room. She was changing. It wasn't just the pregnancy. The psionic silence that had defined her exile was cracking. She could feel the hum of the ship's core. She could sense the fatigue radiating off Elias in the cockpit. Elias entered the room, carrying a tray of heated rations. He looked exhausted, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He stopped at the door, watching her. The sight of her glowing, serene alien still unsettled him. It was a reminder of how far out of his depth he really was. "Eat," he said, setting the tray down. "You're glowing brighter. That means you're burning calories." Virelli opened her eyes. The violet irises were swirling with gold flecks. "I can feel them," she said softly. "The baby? No, the stars." Elias blinked. "Okay, that's new. My range is expanding," she explained, picking up a nutrient bar. "Before, my telepathy was a focused beam. Now, it is a net. I can feel the distortion of the slipstream. I can feel the intent of the people we left behind." "Can you feel Kyle?" Elias asked, leaning against the doorframe. Virelli flinched. A shadow crossed her face. "No. He is shielded. But I feel his malice. It is like a cold draft in a warm room." Elias crossed his arms. "We're dropping out of slipstream in 2 hours. There's a mining outpost in the Grimwald Belt, asteroid colony. It's a rock, but it has a mechanic I trust and, more importantly, a Zivaran contact." "A contact?" Virelli asked sharply. "Who?" "An old priest, an exile like you. My sources say he was the keeper of the archives before the purge 20 years ago. If anyone knows about this anomaly," Elias pointed at her stomach, "it's him." The Grimwald Belt was a graveyard of celestial debris, a swirling river of rock and ice orbiting a dying brown dwarf star. The mining outpost, Obsidian Station, was dug deep into the side of a massive iron-heavy asteroid. It was a place of shadows and desperation, lit by flickering halogen floods. Elias docked the ship in a private bay, paying the dockmaster a bribe that would have bought a small moon. They disembarked, hoods pulled low. The station smelled of sulfur and unwashed bodies. Miners with cybernetic limbs glared at them from the shadows of drinking dens. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning for contraband. They found the priest in the lower levels, in a small chapel carved directly into the rock. The air here was cooler, scented with burning incense that smelled like crushed pine needles, a scent from Zivara. The priest, Elder Joram, was ancient. His skin was like parchment stretched over bone, and his eyes were milky white with blindness. But as Virelli entered, he turned his head sharply, as if he could see her soul. "The lost one," Joram rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "You carry a second heartbeat." Virelli lowered her hood. The golden light of the chapel candles danced on her pale skin. "Elder Joram, I was told you serve the old way." "I serve the truth," Joram said, beckoning them closer. "And the truth has been absent from our world for a long time." He reached out a trembling hand. Virelli hesitated, then stepped forward, allowing him to place his palm on her forehead. The moment skin touched skin, a shockwave of psychic energy rippled through the room. The candles flared. Elias reached for his blaster, but the energy wasn't hostile. It was revealing. Joram gasped, his blind eyes widening. The old light. He moved his hand from her head to her stomach. The glow beneath her tunic intensified, shining through the heavy fabric. "You were declared barren," Joram whispered. "Yes," Varelli said, her voice trembling. "The ceremony. Nothing happened. Lies." Joram spat. He closed his eyes and his mind pushed into hers, not an invasion, but a guide. Look deeper." The flashback hit Varelli with the force of a physical blow. She was back in the Hall of Resonance, but this time, she was not in her own body. She was watching from above, a detached consciousness floating in the memory. She saw herself standing on the dais, terrified and hopeful. She saw the high priest, and she saw Kale. He was standing in the shadows of the control alcove, hidden from the crowd. He was holding a datapad linked to the resonance prism. As Varelli began to focus her energy, Kale tapped a sequence of commands. A dampening field, invisible and undetectable to the sensors, enveloped the dais. It didn't stop her power. It swallowed it. It masked the signal, turning a symphony into silence. Varelli looked at Kale's face. He wasn't smiling. He looked afraid. He looked at the readout on his pad, a spike of potential energy so high it would have shattered the records. She wasn't infertile. She was a conduit for power the likes of which Zivara had not seen in 1,000 years. To let her ascend would be to lose control. So he muted her. The vision shattered. Varelli stumbled back, gasping for air. Elias caught her. "What happened?" Elias demanded. "What did you do to her?" "He showed me." Varelli breathed, clutching Elias's arm. "He showed me the truth. Kale rigged it. He dampened the field. The child proves it," Joram said, his voice gaining strength. "The body does not lie. The ceremony is a machine, and machines can be tricked. But life cannot be forged. You carry the future, princess, and that is why they want you dead." Elias looked at the old man, then at Varelli. The political abstraction of her exile had just become concrete. It wasn't tradition, it was a coup. "We need to go," Elias said, his instincts screaming. "This place isn't safe." He was right. The chapel doors exploded inward. Debris showered the room. Elias threw himself over Varelli, shielding her as plasma bolts sizzled through the air, scorching the stone walls. Bounty hunters. 4 of them stormed in, wearing heavy enviro armor, their faces obscured by multispectral visors. They weren't the Zivaran elite. These were mercenaries, hired muscle looking for a payday. "Get to the rear exit," Elias roared, pulling his heavy blaster pistol and firing blindly into the smoke. One mercenary dropped. A hole punched through his chest plate. The others scattered, taking cover behind the stone pews. Joram stood his ground, raising his staff. "You shall not touch the air." A bolt caught the old priest in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell, but he didn't scream. He merely gestured toward a hidden passage behind the altar. "Go!" Elias dragged Varelli toward the opening. She tried to stop, to help Joram, but Elias's grip was iron. "He's gone. Varelli, move!" They scrambled into the dark tunnel, the sound of plasma fire echoing behind them. The passage was narrow, winding through the asteroid's crust. They emerged into a service hangar, far from where the rusty nail was docked. "They found us." Varelli gasped, leaning against a crate. "How did they find us?" "Someone sold us out." Elias grimaced, checking the charge on his blaster. "Probably the dockmaster." "We have to get back to the ship. It's 3 levels up." The run back to the ship was a nightmare of industrial corridors and steam vents. They were intercepted on the gantry bridge overlooking the main reactor core. Two more hunters appeared at the far end of the walkway. Elias fired, pinning them down, but a third dropped from the maintenance rafters behind them. Elias turned, but he was too slow. The mercenary slammed the butt of his rifle into Elias's temple. Elias crumpled, blood spraying from the impact. "Elias!" Virelli screamed. The mercenary kicked Elias's blaster away and leveled his rifle at Elias's head. "The bounty is for the girl alive," he growled. "The pilot is expendable." Virelli froze. Time seemed to slow down. She looked at the barrel of the gun. She looked at Elias, groggy and bleeding on the metal grate. Fear vanished. Logic vanished. All that remained was a primal, white-hot instinct to protect. The dampeners were gone. The neural crown was gone. There was nothing to filter her rage. Virelli stepped forward, her eyes glowing not violet, but a blinding, searing white. She didn't shout. She didn't gesture. She simply looked at the mercenary and pushed. It was a forbidden technique, the mind flay, a direct assault on the synaptic pathways of another being. The mercenary didn't even have time to scream. His rifle clattered to the floor. He grabbed his helmet, convulsing violently as his nervous system was overloaded with raw psionic static. He was thrown backward, not by physics, but by the sheer force of her will, crashing over the railing and falling into the reactor pit below. The other two hunters at the end of the bridge stopped firing. They stared in horror at the glowing figure of the princess. Virelli raised her hand toward them. They ran. Elias groaned, pushing himself up on one elbow. He looked at Virelli. She was standing amidst the steam, terrifying and magnificent, the air around her crackling with energy. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. "Remind me," Elias coughed, wiping blood from his eye, "never to make you angry." Virelli's glow faded instantly. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she checked his wound. I did not mean to." "You saved my life," Elias said, grinning crookedly. "Now let's get the hell out of here." They made it to the rusty nail and blasted free of the station, but the escape was messy. A stray shot from a pursuing patrol ship clipped their aft stabilizer. Warning: the ship's computer drowned. Hull breach in Sector 4. Oxygen venting. Life support failing. Elias wrestled with the controls. "We're losing pressure. I have to divert power to the shields or we'll get disintegrated, but if I do, we lose the atmosphere scrubbers." "Do it!" Virelli cried from the co-pilot seat. Elias engaged the shields. The ship shook as it absorbed a heavy volley of laser fire, then punched into hyperspace. Silence returned, but it was the hissing silence of a leaking ship. The air in the cabin grew thin immediately. The scrubbers were dead. The reserve tanks were damaged. Elias unbuckled and scrambled to the emergency locker. He pulled out an oxygen mask. There was only one. He looked at the mask, then at Virelli. "Put this on," he said, shoving it into her hands. "What about you?" Virelli demanded, pushing it back. "I can hold my breath a long time." Elias lied. "I used to dive for pearls on Earth." "You are lying," Virelli said, her voice getting breathless. "There is only enough for one. 2 people, Elias corrected. "You and the kid. Put it on. Virelli, that's an order." He forced the mask over her face. Virelli struggled, grabbing his wrists, but he held it firm. She looked into his eyes and saw a stubborn resolve that broke her heart. He was trading his life for hers without a second thought. Elias sat back in the pilot's chair, his movements getting sluggish. He watched the star lines of hyperspace blur. His vision tunneled, his chest burned. He focused on the sound of Virelli breathing through the mask, the hiss-click, hiss-click. It was the best sound he had ever heard. Just as the darkness began to swallow him, he felt a hand on his face. Virelli had pulled the mask off. She took a deep breath of the pure oxygen, then leaned over and pressed her lips to his. She exhaled the oxygen into his lungs. Elias gasped, his body reflexively inhaling her breath. "We shared," she commanded, her voice fierce despite the hypoxia. She took another breath from the mask, then passed it to him. Back and forth, a kiss of life in the cold dark. They stayed like that for an hour, huddled together in the cockpit, passing the single mask between them, keeping each other alive until the automated repair drones finally sealed the breach and the scrubbers kicked back on. When the air was breathable again, they were both exhausted, slumped against the console. The ship had dropped out of hyperspace to cool the engines, drifting in the shadow of a gas giant known as the Azure Titan. The view outside was breathtaking. The planet's magnetic field was interacting with a solar storm, creating vast undulating curtains of artificial auroras, neon greens, deep purples, and electric blues dancing across the void. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after you have looked death in the face and blinked. Virelli sat watching the lights, her hand resting on Elias's knee. "You almost died," she said softly. "Hazard of the trade," Elias murmured, though his hand shook slightly as he took a sip of water. "Why?" she asked. "Why give me the mask? You could have taken it. You are the pilot. Without you, the ship is useless. Logic dictates—" "To hell with logic," Elias interrupted gently. He turned to face her. "You asked me once why humans choose desire over logic. Why do we do things that don't make sense?" He reached out and placed his hand over hers, on top of her stomach. "Because this is the future. Virelli. You. Him. I'm just on the ride. My job is to get you there." Virelli looked at him, tears shimmering in her violet eyes. The auroras reflected in her irises, making the whole universe seem trapped in her gaze. "You are not just the ride," she whispered. "You are the only one who ever saw me. Not the princess, not the exile, just me." Elias cleared his throat, looking away to hide the emotion rising in his chest. He wasn't used to being seen either. "Well," he said, his voice rough with affection, "we're going to have to teach the kid some manners. If he inherits your royal attitude, I'm going to be in trouble." Virelli laughed, a sound like bells chimes. "And if he inherits your stubborn jawline and your refusal to follow instructions, then he'll be unstoppable." Elias grinned. They sat there in the glow of the instrument panel, watching the lights dance over the gas giant. For the first time in days, there was no fear, no running, just a man, a woman, and the quiet promise of a revolution growing between them. "We have to go back," Elias said after a while. "Yes." Virelli nodded. "To the Hall of Convergence, to the heart of the lie." Elias checked his blaster, sliding it back into the holster. "Then let's go crash a coronation." The rebel outpost of Ironhold drifted in the debris field of a shattered moon. A rusted collection of pressurized habitats bolted to the corpse of a derelict mining carrier. It was a place where the unwanted of the galaxy gathered. Political dissidents, escaped indentured servants and smugglers who had grown a conscience. For Princess Virelli, it was the first stage of her war. She stood in the center of the comms array, a circular room filled with tangled cables and stolen signal boosters. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Elias stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching her. He had spent the last 6 hours wiring the outpost's transmitter to bypass the Zivaran subspace firewalls. It was a suicide hack. Once they broadcast, every sensor in the quadrant would pinpoint their location. "Ready?" Elias said, his voice tight. "We have a 60-second window before they triangulate the source and jam us. Make it count." Virelli smoothed the front of her flight suit. She wore no royal robes, no jewels, no neural crown. She looked tired, her hair braided back severely, grease stains on her collar. But her eyes burned with a violet intensity that made the rebel technicians avert their gaze. "Open the channel," she commanded. Elias threw the switch. The hum of the transmitter rose to a shriek. Across the Zivaran Empire, screens flickered, from the diamond spire penthouses of the highborn to the subterranean hab blocks of the mineral castes. The pristine, state-sanctioned feeds of the Imperial network dissolved into static. Then, Virelli's face appeared. "People of Zivara," she began, her voice calm, magnified not by microphones but by a subtle telepathic undercurrent she wove into the audio frequency. "I am Virelli of House Ethelgard. You were told I was broken. You were told I was barren. You were told I was exiled to preserve the sanctity of the continuity." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy across a billion screens. She placed her hands on her stomach, which was now visibly swollen beneath the fabric of her suit. They lied. She closed her eyes and pushed. She didn't just speak, she projected. She broadcast the sensation of life, the thrumming golden resonance of the child growing inside her. It was a raw, undeniable psionic pulse that traveled through the subspace carrier wave, touching the mind of every Zivaran watching. It was a feeling of hope, of terrifying strength, and of undeniable legitimacy. "I return not as a failure, but as a mother," she declared, her eyes snapping open, glowing fiercely. "I carry the proof of their deception. This child is the union of the old blood and the new. He is the future you were denied." The transmission cut to black as the jammers slammed into place. In the comms room, silence reigned for a heartbeat. Then, the rebel comms officer looked up, his face pale. "Goddess," he whispered. "The network, it is lighting up. The lower sectors are flooding the streets. They are chanting your name, in the spire of ascendancy." The mood was apocalyptic. Prince Kael stared at the blank screen where his cousin's face had been moments ago. The crystal goblet in his hand shattered, slicing his palm. But he didn't seem to notice the blood dripping onto the pristine white floor. The city of glass below the spire was usually a grid of orderly light. Now, he could see fires burning in the industrial districts. He could hear the psychic roar of the populace, a chaotic, angry buzz that pressed against the mental shields of the citadel. "She dares," Kael hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and genuine fear. "She brings a mongrel beast to our doorstep and calls it the future." His generals stood around the strategy table, looking uneasy. The people are confused. "My prince," General Hrock said cautiously. The psionic pulse, it was strong. They felt the child. "They know it is of the blood." "It is a parasite," Kael screamed, slamming his fist onto the table. "It is a human contamination wrapped in royal genetic material. It is an abomination." He turned to the console and punched in his authorization code. A holographic seal appeared, the symbol of the red eclipse. "Initiate the protocol of cleansing," Kael ordered. The general stiffened. "My prince," Hrock stammered. "That is the Doomsday Clause. It authorizes the use of orbital kinetic strikes within planetary borders. It declares the target non-sentient." Kael finished cold. "She is no longer Zivaran. She is a biological hazard. And the creature inside her is a pathogen. Issue the order to the home fleet. Any vessel carrying the exile is to be vaporized upon entry. If she makes it to the surface, execute them on sight. There will be no trial. There will be no debate." He looked out the window at the burning city. "Burn the infection out," he whispered, "before it spreads." The flight from the rebel outpost to the Zivaran homeworld was a blur of violence. The rusty nail, painted with radar-absorbent matte black, slipped into the system amidst a chaotic blockade. The rebel fleet, a ragtag collection of retrofitted mining haulers and pirate skiffs, had launched a diversionary attack on the outer perimeter, drawing the heavy cruisers away. But the home guard was waiting. "We have a lock," Elias shouted, his hands flying across the controls. "Atmospheric entry in 10 seconds. Shields are at 30%. The ship shook violently as plasma flak exploded around them. Virelli sat in the co-pilot seat, her mind extended outward, acting as a living sensor array. "3 interceptors on R6, she called out, wincing as she felt the hostile intent of the pilots behind them like needles in her brain. "Brake right! Elias!" Elias yanked the yoke. The ship spiraled, the artificial gravity generators whining in protest. A laser beam sliced through the void where they had been a microsecond before. "I can't shake them," Elias yelled. "They are too fast." One of the pursuing ships broke formation, diving ahead to cut them off. It was a sleek, silver craft, shaped like a dagger. Virelli recognized the psionic signature of the pilot immediately. It was heavy, disciplined, and painfully familiar. "It is Valen," she whispered. Commander Valen, her personal bodyguard since she was a child, the man who had taught her to shield her mind, the man who had wept silently as he marched her to the exile pod. Now, he was hunting her. The silver ship spun, facing them head-on. "Stop your vessel. Exile." Valen's voice crackled over the comms, calm and deadly. "Or I will dismantle you piece by piece." Elias didn't lift his foot from the throttle. "Tell your friend to move," he gritted out. "Valen." Virelli projected, throwing her thoughts directly into the commander's mind. "Do not do this. You felt the broadcast. You know what I carry. I know you threaten the order of the realm," Valen replied, his mental voice like a steel wall. "Duty is absolute." He fired. A precision pulse cannon shot clipped the port engine of the rusty nail. The explosion rocked the ship, sending shrapnel tearing through the cockpit. Elias screamed as a jagged piece of metal conduit blew inward, slicing into his thigh. The control panel sparked and died. "We're going down!" Elias gasped, clutching his leg, blood welling up between his fingers. The ship entered the atmosphere in an uncontrolled tumble. Fire roared outside the viewports. The sky turned from the black of space to the searing blue of Zivara. Virelli unbuckled her harness. She threw herself over Elias, using her body to shield him from the debris, wrapping her mind around the ship's hull in a desperate attempt to hold the disintegrating metal together telekinetically. "Hold on," she screamed. The ground rushed up to meet them, a vast expanse of crystalline dunes outside the capital city. The impact was a thunderous, bone-shattering crash. The ship plowed through a dune of singing sand, shearing off its wings, rolling 3 times before coming to a screeching, smoking halt against a jagged rock formation. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of coolant and the groan of settling metal. Virelli coughed, waving away the acrid smoke. She checked herself, bruised, shaken, but whole. Her hand went immediately to her stomach. The child kicked, a strong, angry protest. He was safe. "Elias," she gasped. Elias was slumped in the pilot's seat. His face was gray, covered in a sheen of sweat. The metal shard was still embedded in his leg, and blood was pooling on the deck plates. His breath came in shallow, wet rasps. "I'm okay," he wheezed, trying to sit up and failing. "Just a scratch." Virelli scrambled to him, ripping the sleeve of her flight suit to make a tourniquet. She tied it tight above the wound, ignoring his grunt of pain. "We have to move," she said, her voice trembling. "Valen saw us go down. He will be here in minutes." Elias looked at her, his eyes unfocused. "Virelli, I can't run. My leg is shredded. I'll only slow you down." "No," she said firmly. "Listen to me," he rasped, grabbing her hand. "The Hall of Convergence is 5 miles south. You have to get there. You have to stand before the council. If they catch us here, then we both die. If you go alone, you might make it." "I am not leaving you," she stated, pulling his arm over her shoulder. Elias resisted, his weight heavy. "Think about the kid. Virelli, use your logic." "To hell with logic," she sobbed, quoting him back to himself. "We are a family. If we die together." She hauled him up. Elias groaned, agony etched on his face, but he found his footing, leaning heavily on her. They stumbled out of the broken airlock and into the blinding sunlight of the Zivaran afternoon. The dunes sang around them, a low, resonant vibration caused by the wind passing over the crystal structures. In the distance, the spire of ascendancy pierced the clouds, a needle of accusation. They made it less than a mile before the shadow fell over them. Valen's interceptor hovered silently above the sand, its engines creating a localized sandstorm. The cargo ramp lowered, and Commander Valen descended, flanked by a squad of elite royal guards. He wore ceremonial armor of white and gold, but his helmet was off. His face was hard, lined with regret. "Stop!" Valen commanded, raising his weapon. Elias tried to raise his blaster, but his hand was shaking too badly. He slumped to his knees in the sand, dragging Virelli down with him. "Valen," Virelli pleaded, stepping in front of Elias, "look at me. Look at what they are making you do." "You are a traitor to the blood," Valen said, though his voice wavered slightly. "The prince has ordered your execution." "Then do it," Virelli challenged, spreading her arms. "But know that you are killing the last true heir of Zivara." Valen hesitated. He looked at the defiant woman, covered in dirt and blood. He looked at the human bleeding out in the sand, and he looked at her stomach. He could feel it, the faint, undeniable pulse of the old light radiating from her. "Secure them." Valen ordered his squad, lowering his rifle. "Commander," one of the guards questioned. "The order was executed." "Secure them," Valen roared. "We take them to the hall. If she is to die, it will be by the law, not by a roadside execution." The Hall of Convergence was a cavernous amphitheater located at the base of the spire. It was here that the laws of the Empire were written and unwritten. Virelli and Elias were dragged into the center of the chamber. Elias was barely conscious, his boots scraping against the polished obsidian floor. They were thrown to their knees before the High Council, 12 elders floating in anti-gravity pods. Above them, on the obsidian throne, sat Queen Izala. She looked older than Virelli remembered, her face a mask of porcelain fragility. Beside her stood Kale, radiating triumph and malice. "So," Kale sneered, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the chamber, "the prodigal returns, and she brings her pet." He walked down the steps of the dais, stopping a few feet from them. He looked at Elias with undisguised revulsion, then turned his gaze to Virelli. "You have caused quite a stir, cousin. Riots in the streets, confusion in the fleet, all for a lie." "It is no lie," Virelli said, her voice ringing clear. "I demand the right of recognition. I demand a scan." "Denied," Kale snapped. "You are an exile. You have no rights." He circled them like a shark. "However," he said, pausing, "the Queen is sentimental. She wishes to offer you mercy." Virelli looked up at her mother. The Queen did not meet her eyes. "Renounce the child," Kale said softly. "Admit that it is a product of genetic tampering, a human parasite. Allow us to extract it, and we will rehabilitate you. You will undergo purification. You will live out your days in a comfortable monastery on the southern continent." Elias here will be given a quick, painless death. Elias let out a wet, rattling laugh. Generous guy, he muttered. And if I refuse? Virelli asked, her voice ice. Then you will be executed publicly as a traitor, and the human will be flayed alive, Cale smiled. Virelli looked at Cale, then she looked at the council. Finally, she looked at her mother. I refuse, she said. Cale sighed. Pity. Elders, record the verdict. The prisoner is hostile. The prisoner is— I am not finished, Virelli shouted. She struggled to her feet, shaking off the guards who tried to restrain her. She closed her eyes, centering herself. She didn't reach for the neural network. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the life inside her. She tapped into the bond she shared with the child, a bond forged in the chaos of the crash, the intimacy of the oxygen mask, the love she felt for the broken man beside her. She turned that love into light. Look, she screamed, not with her voice, but with her mind. The explosion of psionic energy was blinding. It wasn't the cold, calculated blue of Zeveron telepathy. It was gold. It was warm. It was dazzlingly bright. It flooded the Hall of Convergence, passing through the physical shields of the council members. For a moment, everyone in the room felt it. They didn't just see the light. They felt the heartbeat. 2 hearts, 1 rhythm. They felt the undeniable signature of the progenitors, the ancient kings and queens of legend. The child was not an abomination. It was a singularity. Gasps erupted from the gallery. One of the elders wept openly. Queen Izala stood up, her hand covering her mouth. She could feel it, the genetic resonance. It was stronger than Cale's. It was stronger than her own. It is the truth, the queen whispered. Cale staggered back, shielding his eyes. Stop it, he shrieked. She is using glamour. She is manipulating you. He saw the faces of the council. He saw the awe. He saw his power evaporating in the face of this biological miracle. The doomsday clause wouldn't hold. The people would storm the palace if they knew. He realized, with cold clarity, that he had lost the argument. But he still had a weapon. I will not let you destroy this empire, Cale screamed. He drew a disruptor pistol from his robes. It was a cowardly weapon, designed to scramble the nervous system and liquefy organs. He didn't aim at Virelli. He knew her shields were up, bolstered by the pregnancy. He aimed at the source of her strength. He aimed at the human. Die! Kyle shouted. The trigger squeezed. Elias saw it. He saw the barrel rise. He saw Cale's eyes lock onto him. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have psionic shields. He couldn't run on his shattered leg. But he could move. With the last reserve of his strength, Elias lunged, not away from the danger, but directly into the line of fire, twisting his body to shield Virelli completely. No! Virelli screamed, her mental voice shattering glass in the upper balconies. The disruptor bolt hit Elias square in the chest. There was no blood, just a sickening sound of wet impact and the smell of burning flesh. Elias was thrown backward, crashing into Virelli. They both went down, tangling in a heap on the polished floor. The golden light in the room vanished, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Virelli scrambled out from under him, frantically turning him over. Elias lay on his back, his eyes staring up at the vaulted ceiling. His chest was a ruin of scorched fabric and skin. He wasn't breathing. Elias? Virelli whimpered, shaking him. Elias, please! Logic! Use logic! You have to breathe! His heart had stopped. Virelli threw her head back and let out a scream that was not human. It was a psychic shockwave of pure, unadulterated grief. It cracked the obsidian floor beneath them. It blew out the windows of the hall. It knocked the guards to their knees. Kyle stood over them, the smoking gun in his hand, his face twisted in a rictus of madness. Problem solved, he panted. But he was wrong. The problem had just become a catastrophe. Virelli stopped screaming. She looked down at Elias's still face, and then she looked up at Kale. Her eyes were no longer violet. They were black voids, and the air in the hall began to boil. The silence in the Hall of Convergence did not last. It was shattered by the chaotic, deafening roar of a political order collapsing in real time. Virelli stood over Elias's body. The smell of ozone and seared flesh was thick in the air, burning her nostrils. She did not weep. The time for tears had passed the moment Kale pulled the trigger. Now, there was only cold, crystalline clarity. Her psionic field, usually a fluid aura of violet light, hardened into a jagged defensive perimeter. It pushed outward, physically shoving the royal guards back. Kyle stood frozen, his disruptor pistol still raised, his face a mask of disbelief. He had expected the human to die and the princess to break. He had not calculated the variable of rage. "Get a stasis chamber," Virelli commanded. Her voice was not a scream, it was a decree. It carried the weight of a telepathic hammer blow, slamming into the minds of every medic and attendant in the gallery. It was an order that bypassed the auditory nerves and commanded the motor cortex directly. 2 medical drones hovered down from the upper tiers, followed by a team of terrified trauma surgeons. They didn't look to Kale for permission. They looked at the glowing, terrifying woman whose eyes were voids of black energy. Kale took a step forward, his hand shaking. "Stop! I command you to—" Virelli turned her head. She didn't raise a hand. She simply looked at him. A kinetic blast, sharp and precise, struck Kale in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the base of the obsidian throne. He crumpled, gasping for air, his weapon skittering across the floor. "Save him," Virelli whispered to the chief surgeon, her voice dropping to a lethal quiet. "If his spark fades, so does this city." The surgeons worked with frantic efficiency. They deployed a portable stasis field, a shimmering bubble of time-dilating energy, around Elias. His chest stopped moving and the blood suspended in mid-air. He was frozen in the second between life and death, trapped in a gray amber of preservation. Virelli placed her hand on the cold surface of the field. She looked at Elias's face, frozen in a grimace of pain and determination. "I will return for you," she promised, her thought penetrating the barrier, hoping that in the silence of stasis, he could still hear her. She turned away. The medics rushed the stasis pod toward the emergency lifts. Kale was struggling to his feet, helped by 2 hesitant guards. Queen Izala stood by the throne, her hands clutching the royal seal around her neck, her face pale as milk. Virelli walked to the center of the dais. The hall was in chaos, shouts from the gallery, guards unsure of their allegiance, the council members arguing in their hoverpods. "Silence," Virelli spoke. The word rippled through the chamber, amplified by the acoustics of the singing crystal walls. The noise died instantly. Virelli looked up at the recording drones that were still hovering, broadcasting the feed to the entire planet. She looked at the council. She looked at the millions of citizens watching from their homes, their factories, and their streets. She placed a hand on her stomach. The black voids of her eyes faded, returning to a burning, lucid violet. "You called me Baron," she said, her voice steady, resonating in the skulls of everyone present. "You exiled me because the prism showed no light. You stripped me of my name. You hunted me across the stars." She took a step toward the council elders, who flinched as if she were wielding a physical weapon. "But I was never infertile," she declared. "The ceremony was not a test of biology. It was a test of compliance. And I failed because my body rejected your stagnation." She pointed a trembling finger at Kyle, who was leaning against the throne, panting. "You did not exile me because I was empty. You exiled me because you feared what I was full of. You feared the future I carried. She swept her gaze across the room. This child is not a contaminant. He is the bridge. He is proof that we can be more than statues in a crystal museum. We are dying, Zivara. Our bloodlines are thinning. Our psychic echo is fading. We need life. We need change. And because I offered it, you tried to kill me. The broadcast carried her words, but the psionic carrier wave carried her truth. It washed over the planet like a tidal wave. In the lower districts, the workers felt her anguish and her hope. In the academies, the students felt her defiance. The lie of the purity laws, which had held their civilization in a chokehold for 1,000 years, shattered under the weight of a mother's fury. Kale saw the shift. He checked his data pad. The loyalty metrics of the Home Guard were plummeting. The city grid was lit up with protest markers. "Cut the feed!" Kale shrieked at the technicians. "Cut it now!" But the technicians did not move. They were staring at Varelli, tears streaming down their faces, caught in the updraft of her emotional projection. Varelli turned to the Queen. "Mother," she said, the word heavy with judgment. "Will you stand with the liar, or will you stand with your blood?" Queen Izala looked at Kale, then at her daughter. She looked at the stasis pod disappearing into the lift. For decades, she had been a statue, a figurehead trapped in protocol. But the sight of the unborn child's psychic signature, that golden, undeniable pulse, had woken something ancient in her. She descended the stairs. Kale grabbed her arm. "Do not do this," he hissed. Izala pulled her arm free with a strength that surprised them both. She walked until she stood before Varelli. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from Varelli's face. "I saw the light," Izala whispered, her voice trembling. "In the hall. I saw the gold. It was the old light, the light of the founders. You let them throw me away," Varelli said, not flinching. "I was afraid," the Queen admitted, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I was told it was necessary. I was told." She fell to her knees. It was an act that made the council gasp. The Queen of Zivara did not kneel. "Forgive me," Izala wept. "I believed the lie because it was easier than fighting it. But I always doubted. In the dark, I doubted." She looked up, desperation in her eyes. "Come back to the fold. Varelli, I will reinstate you. I will give you the crown of whispers. You will be the primary heir. I will protect you." Varelli looked down at her mother. A week ago, this offer would have been everything she ever wanted. Now, it felt like a trinket. "I do not want your protection," Varelli said coldly. "And I do not want your crown. Not if it comes with conditions." "There are no conditions," Izala cried. "There are," Varelli countered. "I will not return alone. I will not hide the father of this child." Kale laughed, a sharp, manic sound from the throne. "The human? You want amnesty for the dirt scavenger? He is dead. Varelli, or he will be, the moment I pull the plug on that stasis unit." Varelli's head snapped toward him. "If you touch him, Kale, I will tear this spire down stone by stone. I demand full amnesty for Elias Thorne," Varelli announced to the room. "And I demand that my son Kieran be recognized as a prince of the blood with full rights of succession." "Never!" Kale roared. He pushed himself off the throne, his face twisting. A half-breed on the throne? A mongrel ruling the High Council? "I will burn this city to ash before I let that happen." He tapped a command on his wrist gauntlet. Throughout the citadel, the alarms changed pitch. They went from the pulsing yellow of civil unrest to the screaming crimson of martial law. The doors to the Hall of Convergence slammed open. Hundreds of soldiers poured in. But they were not the royal guard in their white and gold. These were the Red Eclipse, Kale's private paramilitary force, armored in black plasteel, faces hidden behind void visors. They carried heavy suppression rifles and psionic dampeners. "I am invoking the Emergency Preservation Act," Kale shouted, his voice cracking. "The Queen is compromised. The exile is a hostile combatant. Seize them. Treason," General Hrock shouted, drawing his ceremonial sword. The Red Eclipse opened fire. The hall erupted into chaos. The council members screamed as their hoverpods were blasted out of the air. General Hrock fell in a hail of plasma fire. Virelli grabbed her mother and pulled her behind a pillar of crystal. "We have to go," Virelli shouted over the roar of the blasters. "My guards," Izala stammered, in shock. "Your guards are dead or turning," Virelli said. "Kyle has been planning this for years." She looked for an exit. The main doors were blocked by a wall of black armor. The Red Eclipse troops were advancing, firing indiscriminately into the crowd of nobles. Virelli closed her eyes. She reached out with her mind, past the chaos, past the fear. She felt the city outside. She felt the anger of the people, and she felt something else, rebels. They were close. The broadcast had been the signal. The uprising hadn't just started in the streets, it had started in the hangars, in the kitchens, in the maintenance tunnels of the spire. A massive explosion rocked the foundation of the hall. The east wall, a sheet of reinforced glass overlooking the city, shattered inward. Through the smoke, grapple lines shot up. Figures in mismatched armor, wielding stolen mining lasers and kinetic slug throwers, swung into the chamber. At the lead was a towering figure in a battered flight suit. It was the rebel commander from the Ironhold outpost, flanked by defecting royal guards who had torn the insignias off their chests. "For the princess," the commander roared. The room descended into a brutal melee. The rebels clashed with the Red Eclipse. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, melting the crystal walls. Virelli looked at the chaos. She saw her people dying for her. She saw the future hanging by a thread. She could not just be a symbol anymore. She had to be a weapon. She stepped out from behind the pillar. "Virelli!" Izala screamed, reaching for her. Virelli didn't look back. She focused her mind. She visualized the anger, the love, the fear, and the sheer biological power of the life inside her. She pulled it all into a single point of focus in her right hand. The air around her fingers warped, dust motes ignited. With a sound like a cracking whip, a blade of pure energy manifested in her grip. It wasn't the blue steel of a standard psionic saber. It was a jagged, humming length of violet fire, cored with a blinding golden white. It was a psionic blade, a weapon that hadn't been seen since the wars of the progenitors. She swung the blade. It passed through the barrel of a Red Eclipse rifle as if it were smoke, then sliced through the armor of the soldier holding it. "To me!" Virelli shouted, her voice commanding the rebels. She charged. She moved with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for a pregnant woman. But the child's energy was sustaining her, flooding her muscles with adrenaline and telekinetic buoyancy. She was a whirlwind of light. She deflected plasma bolts with the blade, sending them ricocheting back into the attackers. She used telekinetic shoves to clear paths, throwing armored soldiers across the room like dolls. "Push to the throne," she ordered. The rebels rallied around her, a wedge of desperate fury cutting through the black ranks of Kale's troops. They fought their way up the stairs of the dais. Kale saw her coming. He saw the blade. He saw the terrifying inevitability of her advance. "Retreat," Kyle screamed to his personal detail. "Fall back to the sanctum." He turned and ran, disappearing through the blast doors behind the throne. Virelli didn't stop. She reached the heavy doors just as they began to seal. She didn't wait for a code. She thrust the psionic blade into the metal. Sparks showered over her. She pushed, her mind screaming with effort, and carved a molten slit through the 3-foot-thick plasteel. The doors groaned and buckled. With a final telekinetic shove, she blew them off their tracks. She stepped into the sanctum. It was a circular room at the very pinnacle of the spire, open to the sky, surrounded by force fields. It was where the ancient kings had communed with the stars. Kyle was there. He was backing away toward the edge of the platform, his chest heaving. His elite guard lay dead at the entrance, cut down by the rebel snipers who had taken the high galleries. It was just the two of them. Virelli deactivated her blade. The light vanished, leaving her panting, sweat dripping down her face. Her flight suit was torn, stained with the blood of enemies and the dust of the crash. She looked wild. She looked regal. "It is over." "Kyle," she said, her voice echoing in the wind that whipped around the spire. "The city has fallen. Your forces are surrendering." Kyle laughed. It was a wet, broken sound. He looked over the edge, down at the burning city, then back at her. "It is never over." "Cousin, you think the galaxy will accept this? You think the other great houses will trade with a mongrel queen? You have destroyed our purity. You have doomed us to mediocrity." "We were already mediocre," Virelli said, stepping closer. "We were stagnant, beautiful, preserved corpses. This—" She gestured to the fires below, to the chaos. "This is birth. Birth is messy. Kale." Kale's eyes darted around the room. He was cornered, a rat in a trap. Suddenly, he lunged, not at her, but at a pedestal near the edge. He grabbed something, a heavy, archaic weapon. It was a kinetic repeater, a relic from the brutal wars before the unification. It didn't fire energy. It fired solid, explosive rounds. Psionic shields were useless against it. He spun around, leveling the weapon at her stomach. "No throne accepts impurity," he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Virelli froze. She couldn't dodge. She couldn't deflect a solid projectile with her mind fast enough. "Die!" Kale shrieked. He pulled the trigger. The hammer dropped. The firing pin struck the primer, but the bullet did not leave the chamber. A blinding pulse of golden light erupted, not from Virelli, but from her womb. It was a defensive reflex, a preconscious survival instinct of the child who sensed the immediate threat to its existence. The energy didn't expand outward. It focused instantly on the point of danger. It flowed into the barrel of Kale's weapon. The prophecy of the 8th scroll, the weapon of the oppressor shall shatter against the innocent blood, manifested in a violent physics lesson. The energy spike superheated the round inside the chamber. The kinetic repeater didn't just misfire, it detonated. The explosion was deafening. The weapon disintegrated in Kale's hands. Kale screamed as the blast threw him backward. He slammed into the force field at the edge of the platform, sliding down to the floor. His hands were ruined, blackened and useless. He stared at them, whimpering, his mind shattered by the shock. Virelli stood unharmed. The golden aura around her stomach faded slowly, pulsing once, twice, then settling back into a contented hum. She walked over to Kale. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with superstitious terror. What is it?" he gibbered. "What is inside you?" "A king," Virelli said softly. Rebels burst into the sanctum, weapons raised. They saw Kale broken on the floor and Virelli standing over him. They lowered their guns. "Take him," Virelli commanded, turning away. 2 rebels dragged the screaming prince away. Virelli walked to the edge of the platform. She looked out at the city. The fires were being extinguished. The fighting was dying down. The red lights of martial law were flickering out, replaced by the white lights of the emergency broadcast. She felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled. Commander Valen, who had fought his way up with the rebels after his defection in the desert, caught her arm. "Easy, princess," he murmured. "It is done." Virelli leaned against the railing. She looked down. Thousands of people were gathering in the plaza below the spire. They were looking up, waiting. She took a deep breath. She wiped the blood from her cheek. She placed both hands on her stomach. "Help me stand," she said to Valen. He supported her as she stepped onto the balcony. The roar from below was a physical force. It wasn't the polite applause of the court. It was the raw, guttural cheer of a people who had been waiting for permission to breathe. Virelli raised her hand. She didn't need a crown. She didn't need a robe. She stood there, a pregnant woman in a torn flight suit, bloodied but unbroken, cradling the child that had defied an empire. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the sun set on a Zivara that was free. But as the cheers washed over her, Virelli's mind was not on the victory. It was in a cold, silent room deep beneath the city, and the promise she had made to the man frozen in time. "I am coming," she projected into the dark. "Hold on." The transition from death to life was not a sudden gasp, but a slow, viscous ascent through layers of gray fog. Elias Thorne felt weightless, suspended in a medium that tasted like ozone and mint. There was no pain, which was suspicious. The last thing he remembered was the searing heat of a disruptor bolt tearing through his chest, the smell of his own burning skin, and the terrifying sound of Virelli screaming. He opened his eyes. The light was soft, diffuse, and golden. He was not in the afterlife. He was not in a hospital. He was floating inside a vertical cylinder of transparent amber liquid. Through the curvature of the glass, he saw a room that looked less like a medical bay and more like the inside of a diamond. The walls were faceted crystal, pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic light. The liquid drained away with a soft hiss. The cylinder split open. Elias stumbled forward, his legs feeling like gelatin. He expected to hit the floor, but he was caught. Strong, cool hands gripped his arms. He smelled lavender and the static charge of a storm. "Easy," a voice said. "Gravity is still a negotiation for your muscles." Elias looked up. Virelli stood before him. Virelli, but she was not the desperate fugitive in the flight suit, nor the bloodied warrior in the Hall of Convergence. She wore a gown of shifting white silk that seemed to flow like water over her skin. Her hair was braided with silver filament, and she was heavy with life. Her stomach was round, full, and undeniable against the silk. "Virelli?" Elias croaked. His voice sounded like he had swallowed a handful of gravel. "I am here," she whispered. She touched his chest. Elias looked down, where there should have been a charred ruin of ribs and lung. There was smooth, unblemished skin. Only a faint, starburst-shaped scar remained, a silvery mark that looked almost decorative. "How long?" Elias asked, looking around the opulent room. 6 weeks. Standard galactic time," Virelli answered, guiding him toward a hovering chair that molded instantly to his shape. 6 weeks? Elias blinked, the panic rising. The baby? Kale? The rebellion? Peace. Elias? Virelli soothed, placing a hand on his knee. A shock of warmth traveled through the fabric, grounding him. Kale is in the cryo-prison beneath the citadel. The Red Eclipse has disbanded. The Council is listening. Elias stared at her. She radiated a calm authority that was terrifyingly different from the scrappy survivalism they had shared on the rusty nail. She looked every inch the empress she was born to be. "You did it," Elias breathed. "You actually beat them." "We beat them," she corrected. She leaned in, her face close to his. Her violet eyes searched his, looking for the man behind the trauma. "You died. Elias," she said softly, her voice trembling for the first time. "Your heart stopped for 3 minutes. The stasis field caught you just as the synaptic firing faded." "I remember," Elias said, a phantom pain throbbing in his chest. "I remember thinking, I didn't want you to be alone." Virelli smiled, and the imperial mask slipped. She looked like the girl who had eaten stale protein paste in his garage. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not the desperate kiss of the oxygen mask, nor the frantic kiss of the storm. It was slow, deep, and possessive. It tasted of life. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "You missed the fun part," she teased, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I had to threaten to dismantle the Archgeneral's mind before he agreed to let a human surgeon supervise your regeneration." Elias laughed, and it felt good. It felt real. "Remind me never to argue with you when you're angry." Virelli took his hand and placed it on her stomach. A strong kick pushed against his palm. "He has been waiting for you," she said. Recovery was a strange limbo. Elias spent the next 2 weeks relearning how to walk. His muscles atrophied from the stasis. He roamed the suspended gardens of the palace, a human ghost in a world of alien perfection. He watched Virelli from a distance. She was a force of nature. The coronation was held in the Great Plaza, a sprawling expanse of white stone beneath the twin suns of Zivara. Millions had gathered. The air vibrated with the hum of anti-gravity skiffs and the low-frequency chant of the monks. Elias stood in the VIP gallery, hidden behind a screen of energy-dampening glass. He wore a formal tunic that scratched his neck, feeling like an imposter at a masquerade. Virelli stood on the apex balcony. She refused the traditional crown of starlight, the heavy jewel-encrusted artifact that had weighed down the heads of tyrants for millennia. "Citizens of the continuity," her voice boomed, amplified by the crystals embedded in the plaza's architecture. She looked out at the sea of faces, Zivarans of all castes, standing shoulder to shoulder. "For 10,000 years, we have looked inward," she spoke. "We polished our souls until they were hard as diamonds, and just as cold. We called it purity, but purity is just another word for stagnation." She raised her hands. Holographic schematics flickered into existence above the crowd, blueprints of fusion reactors, designs for hyperdrive motivators, agricultural drones, human technology. "I do not claim the title of queen," she announced, the shockwave of her words rippling through the crowd. "The queen sits above. I stand among them. From this day forward, I am the first voice of the Reform Council." She gestured to the schematics. "We have the mind," she said, "but we lack the hands, the humans, the species we mocked as scavengers. They have mastered the art of survival. They build, they adapt, they bleed and they heal. We will open our ports. We will integrate their steel with our crystal. We will learn the strength of alloy." It was heresy. It was a revolution, and the crowd roared its approval. Elias watched, his throat tight. She was rewriting the DNA of her civilization, and she was doing it with the tools he had taught her. The logic of survival. The beauty of a messy, functional machine. She looked up at the gallery, straight at the hidden glass. She couldn't see him, but he knew she felt him. She nodded, a microscopic dip of her chin. "For you," her voice whispered in his head, a private telepathic thread amidst the public broadcast. The labor began 3 days later, during a violent electrical storm that reminded Elias of the night on Bastion 3. The sanctum had been converted into a birthing chamber. It was filled with floating censers burning mildly hallucinogenic herbs and the soft chanting of the midwife priests. Elias held Vareli's hand. Her grip was strong enough to crush bone. "This is inefficient!" Vareli gasped, sweat slicking her pale skin. "Biology is a flaw. Breathe," Elias coached, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "Use logic, remember? Pain is just data." "I hate your logic," she screamed, her back arching as another contraction hit. "I want a stasis field. I want to be unconscious." "You're doing great," Elias soothed, though he was terrified. The energy in the room was spiking. The crystals in the walls were singing a high, piercing note that made his teeth ache. The psionic pressure was immense. Every time she pushed, a wave of telekinetic force rippled outward. Vases shattered. The lights flickered. The midwives had to anchor themselves with gravity boots to keep from being thrown across the room. "He is coming," the high midwife shouted, her 4 hands working with blur-like speed. "The energy readings are critical." Vareli let out a final guttural cry that was half scream, half roar. Her body glowed with a blinding violet light, illuminating the storm clouds outside the window. And then, silence. Elias held his breath. He waited for the cry. He waited for the wail of a newborn filling his lungs with air for the first time. But there was no cry. Instead, a sound echoed in the room that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears. It was a sound heard with the soul. It was laughter. It was a bubbling, joyous mental chime that rang like a silver bell in the minds of everyone present. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated delight. The high midwife gasped, stepping back. "He laughs," she whispered, falling to her knees. The sign of the ascendant, the progenitor's joy. She lifted the child. He was small, slick with fluid and glowing. His skin was a soft, pale gold. He had 10 fingers and 10 toes. But his eyes, when he opened them, were solid, swirling galaxies of violet and brown. "Give him to me," Vareli breathed, reaching out her arms. The midwife placed the infant on her chest. The glow from the child merged with the glow of the mother, creating a soft halo that lit the room. Vareli looked down at him, exhaustion melting from her face. She touched his cheek. "Hello, little star," she whispered. She looked at Elias. He was standing frozen, tears streaming down his scarred face. He looked at his hands, hands that had fixed engines, broken bones, and fired guns. He didn't know if they were gentle enough for this. "Elias," Vareli said softly. "Come." He walked to the bed. He reached out a trembling finger. The baby's tiny hand reached up and wrapped around it. The grip was surprisingly strong. And then Elias heard it, a tiny voice in his head, not words but a feeling. Warmth, safety. "Father." Elias broke. He sobbed, a jagged, ugly sound of pure happiness. He leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead, tasting salt and divinity. "What do we name him?" Elias choked out. Vareli looked at the child, then at the storm raging outside, the chaos that had brought them together. "Kieran," she said. "It means little dark one in your tongue, and dawn in mine." Kieran Thorne. Elias tested the name. "The Prince of Scavengers, the Prince of Two Worlds," Vareli corrected. The euphoria of the birth faded into the quiet routine of new parenthood, which was surprisingly universal. It involved sleepless nights, feeding schedules, and the terrified realization that they were responsible for a life. One evening, a week later, Elias stood on the balcony of the royal suite. The city of Zivara Prime sprawled below him, a breathtaking tapestry of crystal spires and magnetic tramways. It was beautiful, it was perfect, and it wasn't his. He felt the familiar itch of the outsider, the mechanic in the palace. He looked at his reflection in the glass, the scar on his jaw, the rough stubble, the calloused hands. He didn't fit. Virelli stepped out onto the balcony. She was holding Kieran, who was asleep, a small bundle of warmth against her shoulder. She sensed Elias's mood before he even spoke. Her telepathy had returned, stronger and more nuanced than before. "You are projecting loud enough to wake the southern continent," she said softly, standing beside him. "Sorry," Elias muttered, turning away from the view. "Just thinking about leaving?" Elias flinched. She picked it up right out of his head. "Virelli, look at this." He gestured to the city. "Look at you. You're the first voice. You're changing history. And I'm a grease monkey with a criminal record." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The whispers are already starting. The nobles don't like it. A human in the royal wing, it weakens you. It gives your enemies ammunition. Maybe it would be better if I took a ship, stayed in orbit, or went back to the fringe. I could visit. But being here..." He stopped. Virelli had shifted Kieran to one arm and reached out to grab Elias's lapel, pulling him close with surprising strength. "Stop," she commanded. Her eyes flashed. "You think you are a weakness?" she asked, her voice fierce. "Do you remember the pod? Do you remember the mud?" Elias looked away, the flashback hitting him. The rain, the smell of burning ozone, the way she had looked at him, broken and arrogant in the dirt. "I remember," he said. "I was nothing then," Virelli said. "I was a statue that had been knocked off its pedestal. I didn't know how to feel cold. I didn't know how to feel hunger. I didn't know how to survive." She moved closer, pressing the sleeping baby between them. "You taught me that logic without passion is death. You taught me that a scar is better than perfect skin because a scar means you survived." She reached up and traced the line of his jaw, the stubble rough against her fingertips. Flashback. The workshop. The storm. Elias handed her the mug of coffee. "It's called living, Vara. It's messy." "They say I am the first voice," Virelli whispered. "But you gave me the words. You gave me everything they never could. You gave me chaos." She kissed him, and the baby stirred between them, letting out a small, sleepy psychic pulse of contentment. "If you leave, Elias Thorne, I will hunt you down again. And this time, I will blow up your ship myself. So stay." Elias looked at her. He looked at the fierce, terrifying love in her eyes. He realized that the gap between the mechanic and the princess didn't exist anymore. They had built a bridge over it, plank by plank, trauma by trauma. "Okay," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. "I'll stay. But I'm redesigning the Royal Transport Fleet. The engines are embarrassing." Virelli laughed, and the sound drifted out over the city, lighter than air. The day of the Great Council arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The Hall of Resonance had been repaired. The blast marks were gone, but the cracks in the floor where Elias had died had been filled with gold. A Japanese technique Elias had told her about, kintsugi, making the break beautiful. Delegates from the Terran Federation had arrived. It was a historic moment. For the first time, Earth and Zivara were meeting as equals. The doors to the great chamber opened. Virelli entered. She wore robes of deep violet and midnight blue, embroidered with star charts. She did not walk alone. Elias walked beside her. He didn't wear Zivaran silk. He wore a tailored suit of Terran design, black and sharp, with the insignia of the House of Ethelgard pinned to his lapel. He didn't walk behind her. He matched her stride, step for step. The council fell silent. The Terran ambassadors looked stunned to see a human at the right hand of the alien ruler. Virelli ascended the dais. She turned to face the assembly. "We stand at a crossroads," she began, her voice resonating clearly. "For too long, we believed that perfection was a destination. We believed that to mix was to dilute." She looked at Elias. He nodded, a small, grounding gesture. "But strength is not in purity," she continued. "Strength is in the alloy. Iron is strong, but steel is stronger because it is mixed with carbon. We are the iron, they are the carbon. Together, we will build a structure that will not break." She gestured to the Terran delegation. "Welcome to Zivara, not as guests, but as family." The suns were setting as they stepped out onto the great balcony. The roar of the crowd was a physical vibration in the stone beneath their feet. Millions of Zivarans looked up. They held lights, violet for the royalty, gold for the new heir. It was a sea of stars on the ground. Virelli held Kieran in her arms. The boy was awake, his eyes tracking the lights, his small mind reaching out to touch the consciousness of the crowd. He wasn't afraid. He was delighted. Elias stood next to her. He put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. He no longer felt like an imposter. He felt like the guardian of the future. "Look at them," Elias whispered. "They love him." "They love us," Virelli corrected. She looked down at the crowd, then at the man who had pulled her from the wreckage, then at the child who carried the best of both of them. The memories washed over her. The cold humiliation of the ceremony, the terrifying silence of the exile pod, the grit of the garage, the taste of oxygen shared in the dark, the scream of the disruptor bolt, the silence of the stasis field. It had all led to this moment. She stepped forward to the railing, raising Kieran high so the light of the setting suns caught his golden skin. The crowd fell silent, waiting for her word. Virelli smiled, a smile that was both human and alien, fierce and tender. She spoke the truth that would be written in the history archives for 1,000 generations. Her voice carried across the plaza, across the planet, and out into the stars. Her clan banished her as infertile. Alien princess returned holding the human's child.